Hey y'all, Scott here. So I was just working on my definitive list of Nintendo consoles with microphones on them. Yeah, the Game Boy Advance didn't make the list. That's actually a good thing. It's fairly annoying to have to blow into the microphone or something for a game. But I actually found a loophole with some Nintendo systems where you don't actually have to blow into the mic. So all you have to do is grab your system, grab an air horn, bring it close. Your entire life you come to expect this, but then Nintendo decides to throw this at you. Oh f***, the letters are evolving! This is the Game Boy Advance, the last survivor of the Game Boy line, starting with the Game Boy in 1989, upgrading to the Game Boy Color in 1998, and finally reaching the final evolution, the GBA in 2001. And after everything was said and done, I think it's fair to say they ended the line on a high note. The Game Boy Advance was pretty much the ultimate Game Boy. Most of the models played all previous Game Boy games. The GBA's own game library was seemingly endless, and certain revisions introduced features that we may take for granted today, but back then it was like, whoa, the Game Boy folds? This was the first system I owned brand new that wasn't a hand-me-down, and I hold it close to my heart. And it all started back in the mid-90s. The original Game Boy was starting to lose steam. I mean, bless Nintendo's heart. They were able to make this thing last over a decade, but at some point you just gotta look at Game Boy Mortal Kombat and say it's time to move on. This original black and white chunk of a portable was aging rapidly, and Nintendo wanted to create a new handheld that was far more powerful. Enter Project Atlantis. This was an ambitious planned successor to the original Game Boy. With 32-bit hardware, a larger screen, battery life of up to 30 hours, this was 1995. My 3DS doesn't even last 5 hours playing Wario's Woods. Rumors and reports consistently were floating around about Atlantis, and Nintendo did confirm its existence back in the day and originally planned to release it in 1996, before delaying it into obscurity and then just simply shelving the idea. Atlantis was simply far ahead of its time. The system was proving to be too expensive to manufacture and too large for Nintendo's liking. They opted to release revisions and upgrades to the original Game Boy instead to keep interest up. We got the Game Boy Pocket in 1996, the Game Boy Light, a Game Boy with a backlight in 1998 only in Japan, and the Game Boy Color also in 1998. You will find me dead in the ground before I admit the Game Boy Color was simply an upgrade to the original model. I've always considered the Color to be its own system, the first true successor to the Game Boy. It just had so many exclusive games. But it turns out Nintendo just looked at it as more of a souped up Game Boy rather than a true successor. Think the Nintendo DSi to the DS, or the new 3DS to the 3DS. Because of that, a true next generation Game Boy was still being thought of, and while it didn't end up being Project Atlantis, a few of the core ideas that made up that project were incorporated into this new one, codenamed Advanced Game Boy. Oh, I wonder what the final name will be. Initially announced in September of 1999 and fully unveiled at Nintendo's Space World event on August 24th, 2000, the Game Boy Advance was the most radically different looking Game Boy yet. It's long. Oh, and I can play Mario Kart. This was the main game Nintendo was flaunting with the GBA during its unveil. It was always really cool for me to see what used to be home console only series finally making the jump to portable systems. So to have a Mario Kart playable on the go was honestly amazing and easily showcased how powerful this system was at the time. The rest of the GBA titles at Space World during this unveil were just Silent Hill for Game Boy Advance. Was I the only one to not know they made a remake of Silent Hill 1 in the form of a visual novel for the Game Boy Advance as a launch title? Was I? Konami was a big supporter for the system at the event, showing off a new Castlevania and Konami Crazy Racer. Sure, I can deal with this existing. Mega Man Battle Network, Advance Wars, and Golden Sun were also shown off at Space World, with the GBA's launch price announced to be $100. It launched in Japan on March 21st, 2001, here in North America on June 11th, and in Europe on June 22nd. The purple Game Boy Advance was the one I owned, and compared to previous Game Boys, Nintendo definitely decided to widen things out with this model. You know what, compared to the regular format of Game Boy systems up to this point, the original Game Boy Advance is really comfortable, and being in this landscape form factor, in my opinion, balances this whole thing out a lot better than old Hamtaro player over there. Unlike the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, the Advance has 2 whole shoulder buttons. That's it, that's why they called it the Advance. Yeah, you'd think they would have given this thing 4 face buttons as well, but it's whatever. I can take just the shoulder buttons, they're a fine addition. I like how fat and long the shoulder buttons are. It makes them so much more comfortable than every other Nintendo handheld with shoulder buttons. And I do like all the buttons here in general. Everything has a nice softer plastic feel while still feeling incredibly sturdy. It still takes batteries, 2 AA's, and the screen. What the hell am I looking at? This was the biggest drawback of the Game Boy Advance. The screen didn't have a backlight, front light, nothing. It was completely dependent on the lighting around you, and even in the best possible conditions, it was still hard to see the screen. It was never a huge issue, but it was always something that was less than desirable. It's something I can look back at now and say, oh my god, I put up with this? That's when you have to break out the accessories. I'm pretty sure some people built empires out of the Game Boy Advance light business. Here we have Worm Light. Just gotta plug it into this port and blam, I can finally see what I was playing. Oh my god. God. Like I said, the screen was tolerable, but the Sega Game Gear back in 1990 had a backlight. The Atari Lynx had one in 1989. How Nintendo made the Game Boy Light a few years earlier, with the entire selling point being the backlight. So the fact that this advanced Game Boy didn't have one was kind of ridiculous, let's be honest here. Game cartridges were half the size of traditional Game Boy games, yet they packed a way bigger punch. You could still play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games here with the trusty shoulder buttons commanding the video to go widescreen or go back to the aspect ratio God intended. Now all of this is great, but still, that screen, man, it honestly keeps the GBA away from reaching pure greatness. Well, only 2 years later, in 2003, the Game Boy Advance SP released, a full redesign with features that have become Nintendo staples ever since. A lit screen, a clamshell design to protect the screen and become even smaller, and a rechargeable battery. The SP stood for special, and they weren't kidding. I'd consider this to be one of the most important console releases in Nintendo history. This is honestly what I think of when I hear GBA. It's so compact, and the screen actually being usable makes a huge difference. Who would have thought? Now, this wasn't a big problem back in the day, but I do find the smaller size of the SP to be less comfortable than the original. These are tic-tac shoulder buttons. Everything feels a bit better with the old one. Nothing's outright bad here, but I do think the original had a perfect balance of being compact, yet comfortable for big and small hands alike. That's not to say the SP isn't comfortable to play, but just in comparison to the original, I think that one's better. And while we're whining about the SP, let me just get this one out of the way. Where's the headphone jack? To save space and money on this unit, Nintendo didn't include a headphone jack. You had to buy an adapter that goes into the charging port. This was honestly never something I thought of as a kid, but I can assure you it annoyed at least one person out there. Plus, if you use the adapter, you can't charge the Game Boy while using headphones. This isn't a modern smartphone, this is a Game Boy, damn it. Other than those little complaints, the SP is the definitive Game Boy. I had the flame red color, and I sunk so much time to this thing. You could play old Game Boy games, new ones too, finally with a screen you can actually see, a rechargeable battery, a stupidly compact design, and Nintendo said, "F it, we made it better." When you look into buying a Game Boy Advance SP nowadays, you may see people specify what model number they have, AGS-001 or AGS-101. The main difference is the quality of the screen's light. 101 has a full backlight, and it is a huge upgrade. This thing is leagues better. The original SP did the job and is perfectly usable, but this is even more usable. That's the only difference between these models, the quality of the screen brightness. You can definitely get by with an AGS-001, but if you don't want to be a fucking loser, then yeah, the 101 is for you. The Game Boy Advance line up to this point was a tremendous success. This was fundamentally how Nintendo made most of their money during the GameCube era. They sold nearly 80 million units of these systems combined. But when 2004 came around, Nintendo released the Nintendo DS for some reason. This was weird because they made it clear this was no replacement for the GBA, rather it was another pillar for their handheld business. Was that some kind of joke? It ultimately was the replacement for the GBA, and they didn't want to say that because that would kill the GBA's sales, plus the DS was a risky move at the time, so if it failed, they could just keep supporting the Advance. I never really got the whole "it's not a replacement" shtick because they said the DS was backwards compatible with the GBA, implying, you know, it was the successor. But releasing the DS in 2004, that was odd. The GBA was such a successful system, and after only 3 years they released a new handheld? Games continued to come out for the Game Boy Advance after that point. It didn't mark the end of the system, but still. After the DS release, Nintendo wasn't finished with new Game Boy models. We got one final Game Boy Advance revision, which was also the final Game Boy in general. This was a giant failure. The Game Boy Micro released in 2005 to 2.5 million lifetime sales and getting discontinued 3 years later. This was in the era Nintendo was kinda trying to mimic Apple. The DS and Wii's marketing always gave me iPod vibes, and the Game Boy Micro sorta felt like their take on something like the iPod Nano. A budget gaming device all about looks and being tiny. The Micro removed Game Boy and Game Boy Color support, which makes it far less useful than the SP. It doesn't work with certain accessories, and its small size can definitely be annoying to some. This is a tiny thing. It almost needs to be seen to be believed. I didn't realize how small the Micro was until holding one for myself, and I hate to admit, but I fell in love with this thing. The Game Boy Micro is one of the most beautiful devices Nintendo's ever created. The screen is absolutely gorgeous, a bit better than the SP-101 actually. It can only play Game Boy Advance games, which is kind of a bummer, but hey, the library is so big that it doesn't matter that much. This is definitely more of a novelty rather than a definitive way to play Game Boy games, but if you can find it for a cheap price, go for it. This is the Famicom Special Edition, made in commemoration of the system's 20th anniversary, but a key attribute of the Micro was swappable faceplates to make your own special edition. It had a lot of cool ideas, but this was definitely not a necessary revision of the Advance. With a launch price of $100 in 2005, it was simply too pricey. It was a far less functional Game Boy Advance coming out after the DS release for $150. That could also play GBA games, and you could find an SP for much cheaper which could play all the Game Boy games in the world, so this was more of a device you buy to make some kind of a fashion statement rather than to just play some games. It may have failed and may be sort of worthless compared to the SP, but I love this thing, it's so cool. I personally think each of the GBA models have strengths compared to each other. The original is the most comfortable, the SP gives you a lit screen, clamshell design, and rechargeable battery, and the Micro is the sleekest and coolest looking. But I think it's pretty obvious, if you had to get one, it would have to be the SP101 model. While the Micro has a slightly better screen, this can play all Game Boy games, the screen is already great and is cheaper than the Micro. Now, why would you buy a Game Boy Advance today? Because this thing has an amazing library of games, over 1,500 titles, 1,400 of them being re-releases. Yeah, that was definitely a trend with the Game Boy Advance, old games thrown onto the system, maybe with a few tweaks here and there, some additions, some alterations, but hey, back then, this was awesome. It was great to be able to play a lot of these legendary games portably, but looking at the first-party lineup now, I have to admit, it's a bit disappointing. Sure, good games are still good games regardless of if they're ports, albeit if they're good ports. Back in 2002, I had no idea Yoshi's Island on the GBA was an old game, and I'm sure other people who grew up with a re-release of a game didn't think of it as an old game, it was just a game. And for the people who played these games on the original systems, it was still pretty cool to be able to play these things portably for the first time ever. However, it does make the Game Boy Advance lack a bit of its own image, and there were simply so many ports and remakes from Nintendo and other companies as well, that now I kind of look at the system as just a portable Super Nintendo and not much else. Because that's where a lot of its most memorable games came from. A good chunk of Nintendo's main series all got remakes or ports, plus one original title. But weirdly enough, the Mario series was an exception. Anybody else find it odd that there was not a single traditional original Mario game on the GBA? There were a lot of Mario games, no doubt, but no traditional platformer. Instead, we got the Super Mario Advance series. These were 4 remakes of 2D Mario titles. Super Mario Advance was a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, followed up by Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2, Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Advance 3, and Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3. These names make me queasy, and I also don't know why they felt the need to shuffle all the games out of chronological order like that. These remakes were pretty solid though. Some of them took versions of these games from Super Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo and squished them onto a GBA cartridge, adding stuff like cutscenes and new sound effects while also changing a few things here and there. Mario Advance 1 and 4 are easily the most unique. Mario World and Yoshi's Island are pretty similar to the original games. I hear people cry about the Yoshi's Island port all the time, screaming it's just not the same. I personally always felt like people were a bit too picky with that. Like sure, the SNES version is definitely the better version, but the GBA release is perfectly fine, like it's still Yoshi's Island, it's just not as nice graphically. Advance 4 was a remake of Mario 3, and it is easily the coolest one of the bunch. They added a ton of stuff, and they changed loads of animations and graphics amongst all the Advance games to make them less dated and weird. Like the scene in Mario 3 always made me fidget in my seat. Here in Advance 4, it looks much more natural. All the Mario Advance games came with a remake of the original Mario Bros. Arcade game, and I love this thing. This is the best version of Mario Bros. In my opinion. The physics are actually tolerable in this version. Main problem with remakes on the GBA though? Screen crunch. These games weren't made for a display this tiny, so they had to zoom in the view a bit, which ends up cutting some things off the screen and leads to you running into enemies you couldn't see or not being able to see as much ahead of you. It is a bit annoying, but it can be dealt with. That sadly does make some of these remakes not as good as the originals by default, when if it wasn't for the screen crunch, they'd potentially be the definitive versions. While these remakes helped supply enough Mario content for GBA players, it was still odd to me that they didn't have an original Mario platformer. Instead, we got a whole lot of side games. Mario vs. Donkey Kong was a puzzle platformer that was pretty much another Donkey Kong 94 from the original Game Boy. That game was amazing, and this one is also pretty great. You just control Mario going through all these puzzle rooms with loads of acrobatics and keys. This was the introduction of the Mini Mario toys, where they then took over the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series with the second game, and we never got to see this style again. man. Nothing screams weird kid on the bus playing Game Boy Advance more than Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. The first in the Mario & Luigi series of RPGs, and potentially the best one. This was the main entry I got into, and yeah, it's definitely a fun one. A wacky RPG where you control both Mario and Luigi, and it also included the Mario Brothers arcade game. Well, now I've gotta say this is the best game of all time. Not all the Mario Game Boy Advance games were winners, though. Care for some Mario Pinball Land? This was weird. They had to structurally reform Mario from the inside out to even get this concept to work. It's okay, I guess. It's just kind of annoying to play for me. These physics never felt like the most right thing in the world to me. Two series that finally made their way onto portable systems with the GBA were Mario Kart and Mario Party. Mario Kart Super Circuit was an original Mario Kart, but included the entirety of Super Mario Kart's tracks as well, which makes sense because Super Circuit is the most similar to Super Mario Kart. The characters kind of look like how they did in Mario Kart 64, but everything else is pretty Super Mario Kart-y. It's a decent enough portable Mario Kart for the time, and just nothing really worth going back to now. Mario Party Advance, I never played, but can you really blame me? It's Mario Party Advance. Camelot made the Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games for the system, as they usually do, but they also worked on their own RPGs for the Game Boy Advance, the Golden Sun games. Golden Sun's a pretty traditional RPG, but with graphics like these, it really stood out on the system. Of course, blown up on a big display, they look kinda rough, but on the original screen, they looked stellar. Yeah, this was a solid game on the system, and that's coming from your local RPG hate and fling smash owner. Nintendo put out a lot of stuff on this thing we hadn't seen prior here in North America. The GBA was the first time Fire Emblem and Advance Wars left Japan. That was huge. These series have been going on since the Famicom, so to finally get them in the States was awesome. Sure, we did get a Fire Emblem anime on VHS here in North America in 1997, but does that really count? Metroid got two games, Metroid Fusion in 2002 and a remake of Metroid 1, Metroid Zero Mission in 2004, two fantastic Metroid experiences. A new original game in the definitive way to play the first one. Fusion is considered Metroid 4 and is just a good 2D Metroid game, the last original 2D Metroid game for like decades, but hey, at least we got Zero Mission as well. A very necessary update to Metroid 1. Zelda had a similar presence. We got a port of Link to the Past featuring a new multiplayer side mode, Four Swords, which later was expanded into its own game on the GameCube, Four Swords Adventures. But the big one was the Minish Cap, developed by Capcom. This is such a great Zelda game. It's just pure top-down Zelda fun. You have a talking hat. I made it clear that, hey, I love what I play of the Zelda games, but I barely finish them. I'm making an oath right now, though, that I will finish the Minish Cap. Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland was a great remake of Kirby's Adventure, and Kirby and the Amazing Mirror was a neat little multiplayer-focused Kirby game. It's actually one of the most unique mainline Kirby games out there. Wario actually took over from Mario in terms of original platformers. We got Wario Land 4! The Wario Land series always weirded me out. Like, it started with the third Mario Land game, it became its own series, and really plays nothing like a Mario game. Which I'm fine with, it's just weird that it all started out with a game titled Mario Land 3. Which is the same as the Yoshi series, starting with a game called Mario World 2. The Sonic Advance series was one of the best things THQ's ever published. It was a fun modernization of 2D Sonic. I still prefer the original classic style, but this was great for the time, and I'd love to see something like this return. The Castlevania GBA games, oh my god. These were amazing handheld entries in the series following the success of Symphony of the Night. I played the first one, Circle of the Moon, and it is so good. Just exploring this giant map, finding upgrades to lead to more areas, it's what you'd want and expect out of a post-Symphony of the Night Castlevania game. Mega Man games were everywhere, especially Battle Network. This was a complete departure from standard Mega Man. It's a side series, tactical RPGs. They made 6. I've heard some of these games were quite good, although they definitely made too many of them. There were the Mega Man Zero games, definitely more in line with what we'd expect from Mega Man, and who could forget Mega Man and Bass, a Super Famicom game that left Japan for the first time on the GBA. It wasn't good. But hey, we actually got F-Zero games on this thing, can you believe it? Pokemon happened here, of course. We got a new generation with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald alongside remakes of the first generation, Fire Red and Leaf Green. But you know me, I'm not big into Pokemon. I think I figured out why though. You see, I didn't grow up with it, and I feel like Pokemon just isn't easy to get into if you didn't grow up with it. But the GBA was how millions experienced Pokemon for the first time, and that can't be undervalued. But of course, like I said, the Game Boy Advance was a re-release fiend. The Donkey Kong Country series, Contra 3, Final Fantasy, Street Fighter, Phantasy Star, Namco Museum, Doom, Earthworm Jim, Mega Man and Bass, oh Jesus, Sonic Genesis, oh f***. There was also the classic NES series, a bunch of old NES games released as cartridges for 20 bucks a pop. I love the packaging here, and the cartridges are even colored to look more like NES games. But some of these titles just were not worth that much money. Japan got cooler boxes though, with tiny replicas of Famicom boxes and neat outer plastic shells. Like I said, the amount of ports is a bit disappointing, but they at least mean the GBA had a rock-solid library. Sure, the DS and 3DS probably had more original new titles from Nintendo and major third parties, but the GBA's library at the time was phenomenal. The fact you could play all these amazing games portably was mind-blowing, and it had some great original new games on top of that. Like Drill Dozer, when Game Freak had some free time between making Pokemon games, they pumped this thing out. You have a giant drill, it's good. It even had Rumble implanted into the cartridge. They had a few of these tumor carts. There was Yoshi Topsy-Turvy with a tilt sensor, nobody needs this, but WarioWare Twisted had a gyroscope. This is still considered as one of the best WarioWare games to many, and hey, WarioWare started on the GBA. I adore WarioWare! Quick bite-sized micro games getting flung at you at lightning speed, it's so great, and the Advance got 2 of them. While its library may have been a bit been there, done that heavy, there was still a little bit of something for everyone on the GBA. It was fairly powerful enough to do things that still impress me. Loads of games still look good to this day. While it was obvious it primarily exceeded at 2D games, seeing 3D stuff run in the system was pretty crazy back then and still impressive now. And it could play episodes of Sonic X. Game Boy Advance Video, cartridges that contained episodes of TV shows with a few movie releases. I owned a few of these back then, and it was pretty cool to watch Nickelodeon shows on my Game Boy. I guess these were made to compete with the portable media craze with iPods, portable DVD players, and the Video Now. I love this thing. Watching these cartridges now? Well, it could be worse. Oh yeah, it definitely could. The e-reader! This was an accessory, alright. Nintendo created this thing to scan cards that contained code. Swipe a card, the e-reader would read the code, and you would unlock certain things in games, or swipe a bunch of these NES cards and play old school NES games. Yes, if you needed more of a reason to believe the classic NES series was overpriced, here are some dirt cheap cards that play the same game. It's a huge novelty, it's kinda cool, but there's not much of a reason to use this now, or to ever use the e-reader even when it was new. The neatest thing it did though, was add new levels to Mario Advance 4. They designed dozens of brand new levels, some that incorporated elements from games like Mario 2 or Mario World. These are crazy. Now you could track down all those special level cards, or you could just download Mario Advance 4 on the Wii U and blam, all the e-reader levels are unlocked, that's nice. Some GameCube games supported the e-reader, which you'd use by linking up the Game Boy Advance with this cable. You could actually link your GBA with a bunch of games to unlock things or play certain mini-games, and sometimes it was recommended, like with Four Swords Adventures or Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. The GameCube also had the Game Boy Player, which allowed to play all Game Boy games on the TV. You see, there was a god, and it was Nintendo in 2003 when they released this thing. But out of all Game Boy Advance accessories or models, they all pale in comparison to the Vistion Dockable Entertainment featuring Game Boy Advance. An entertainment system for vehicles that could also play Game Boy Advance games with a wireless controller. This is by far the most unique and mind-blowing Game Boy Advance model of all time that's sure to put anybody who comes in contact with it into a state of shock and awe.
Oh shit, it's a Game Boy.